There is a peculiar trick that Rome plays on the imagination. You stand before the Colosseum at dusk, the last slant of amber light, catching the ruins of what was once the greatest entertainment complex in the ancient world. And you feel it, the uncanny weight of a civilization that should, by all rights, be gone. And yet it is not gone. The laws that govern modern democracies trace their lineage directly to Roman jurisprudence. The Romance languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people across Europe and the Americas, the calendar we use to mark our days, all Roman inheritances. Rome did not simply fall in 476 AD. It transformed, burrowed itself into the foundations of Western civilization so deeply that digging it out would require demolishing almost everything we have built since. Pierre Grimal understood this intimately. The great French classicist wrote La Civilisation Romaine as an act of intellectual rescue, not to catalogue facts about togas and gladiators, but to illuminate the inner logic of a civilization, how the Romans thought, what they feared, what they desired, how they organized themselves, and why their answers to the perennial questions of human life proved so durable that the echoes still resound today. What follows is a journey through that civilization, its origins shrouded in myth, its republican institutions of breathtaking sophistication, its imperial grandeur, its art and literature and religion, its everyday textures of bread and wine and law, drawn from Grimal's monumental work. It is, in the end, a story about what it means to build something that lasts. Every civilization needs a creation story. The Romans had one of the best. According to the foundational legend, recorded in its most elaborate form by Livy, writing at the height of Augustan Rome, the city was founded in 753 BC by Romulus, descendant of the Trojan hero Aeneas. The story is operatic in its drama. Twin brothers Romulus and Remus, sons of the god Mars and a Vestal virgin, are abandoned as infants on the banks of the Tiber, suckled by a she-wolf, raised by a shepherd, and eventually grow up to found a city on the Palatine Hill. Romulus kills Remus in a quarrel over the sacred boundary of the new settlement, a fratricide that Grimal sees as deeply symbolic. From its very first moment, Rome was a city born in blood, in conflict, in the violent assertion of one man's will over another's. This founding violence would become a permanent feature of Roman self-understanding, but Grimal urges us to look beneath the myth. The city that would rule the world began as a collection of Latin-speaking villages perched on 7 hills overlooking a ford in the Tiber. Its earliest inhabitants were a rough mixture of Latin and Sabine peoples, refugees, outlaws, and landless farmers. Romulus, according to legend, had to populate his new city by opening it as an asylum for fugitives and runaways. The original Romans were, in the most literal sense, people who had nowhere else to go. This origin is crucial to understanding the Roman character. The Romans had no great cultural heritage to fall back on, no millennia of accumulated prestige like the Greeks or Egyptians. What they had instead was an extraordinary talent for borrowing, adapting, and improving. They took the alphabet from the Etruscans, borrowed their gods from the Greeks, absorbed the administrative techniques of conquered peoples, and made them more efficient. Rome's genius was not originality, it was synthesis. The period of the kings, traditionally 753–509 BC, is wrapped in legend, but Grimal extracts from it a genuine historical picture. A small city-state gradually extending power over its neighbors, developing social and political institutions that would define it for centuries. The Romans already showed the trait that would make them formidable, a willingness to integrate outsiders. When they defeated an enemy people, they frequently offered citizenship, transforming conquered subjects into Romans. This was the secret of Roman expansion, already present in embryonic form during the Age of the Kings. In 509 BC, Rome expelled its last king, the tyrant Tarquinius Superbus and establish the Republic. This event marked the beginning of one of history's most remarkable political experiments, a city-state governed not by a single ruler, but by elected magistrates, a senate, and popular assemblies in a carefully calibrated balance of power. The Roman constitution evolved over centuries, through crisis and compromise, through the long struggle between the patricians, old aristocratic families, and the plebeians, the common people who made up the vast majority. This conflict, the conflict of the orders, lasted nearly 2 centuries and was resolved through legal accommodations that gradually extended political rights to the plebs. The genius of the Republican Constitution lay in its mechanisms against power concentration. Executive power was vested in 2 consuls, elected annually, each with the right to veto the other. The Senate exercised enormous advisory authority, amounting to control over foreign and financial policy. Popular assemblies gave citizens a voice in legislation and elections. Underpinning everything was imperium, legitimate authority to command, and its crucial inverse, every magistrate's accountability to the law once his term ended. Grimal notes that this was not democracy in any modern sense. The Republic was deeply oligarchic. The same handful of noble families dominated the consulship generation after generation. But compared to surrounding monarchies, it represented a genuine attempt to distribute power, subject rulers to law, and create a political culture in which the res publica, the Commonwealth, belonged in principle to all citizens. It was this culture that produced the peculiarly Roman virtues Grimal analyzes with such care: gravitas, seriousness of purpose; pietas, dutiful respect toward gods, family and state; virtus, courage and excellence; and above all, fides, trustworthiness. These were civic virtues, the qualities that made a man fit to participate in the Republic's life. The Romans believed with genuine sincerity that the health of the state depended on the moral quality of its citizens. To understand Rome, Grimal insists, you must understand the Roman family, the familia, because it was the fundamental unit around which all Roman social, legal, and moral life was organized. At the center of the familia stood the paterfamilias, the male head of household, whose authority, patria potestas, over family members was, in legal theory, absolute. He had the right of life and death over his children, the right to arrange their marriages, and control over all family property. A Roman son remained legally subject to his father's potestas until the father died or formally emancipated him, even if the son was himself a consul commanding armies. This struck Greek observers as bizarre and even barbaric, but as Grimal explains, the reality was considerably more nuanced. The paterfamilias was constrained by custom, reputation, and the judgment of his peers. Roman culture placed enormous emphasis on the family council, concilium, in which senior male relatives were consulted before major decisions. The law gave him absolute authority. Convention taught him to exercise it with restraint. The position of Roman women is one of the most fascinating and frequently misunderstood aspects of Roman civilization. Legal texts suggest women were perpetually under male guardianship, but the literary and historical record tells a different story, of women wielding enormous influence within the family and through it on public life. Roman matrons like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, were celebrated for their influence over their sons. The ideal Roman mother was expected to be educator, moral guide, and shaper of the men who would shape the Republic. As Rome matured and wealth increased, upper-class women gained practical independence that far exceeded their legal status, managing vast estates and exercising political influence that was invisible in the formal record, but very real in practice. The Romans were, Grimal reminds us, an intensely religious people, but their religion was nothing like the personal, faith-based spirituality that modern readers might imagine. Roman religion was fundamentally communal, contractual, and political. The gods were civic partners, not personal saviors. The Roman conception of the divine relationship was expressed in do ut des. I give so that you may give. Religion was a reciprocal transaction between the human community and the divine powers controlling its fortunes. Romans performed elaborate rituals, maintained temples, offered sacrifices, and consulted entrails and the flight of birds, not out of personal devotion, but civic obligation. If the gods were properly honored, they would protect Rome. If neglected, catastrophe would follow. This transactional view made Roman religion extraordinarily inclusive. When Rome conquered a new people, it had no theological interest in suppressing their gods. Instead, it incorporated them into the Roman pantheon through a ritual act of evocatio, formally inviting a conquered city's protecting deity to take up residence in Rome. The Roman divine world was a perpetually expanding bureaucracy of supernatural powers. Second, it made Roman religion intensely conservative. Since the Republic's health depended on maintaining correct relations with the gods, any departure from traditional ritual was potentially dangerous. The College of Pontiffs, priestly officials overseeing sacred rites, were essentially guardians of institutional continuity, ensuring rituals were performed exactly as always. Rome's religious conservatism mirrored its political conservatism. Both expressed the conviction that ancestral wisdom, mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, was more trustworthy than any individual's novel ideas. No account of Roman civilization can avoid the army. It was, as Grimal shows, not merely an instrument of conquest, but the primary vehicle through which Roman culture spread, and Roman identity was forged. The early Roman army was a citizen militia. Men who owned enough property to equip themselves served as soldiers, and military service was both a legal obligation and a source of civic prestige. A Roman magistrate who had not served in the army was a diminished figure. The greatest honors of the Republic, the triumph, the ovation, were military honors. War was not a regrettable necessity that interrupted civilian life. It was the highest form of civic activity. The professional army of the late Republic and Empire was one of the most formidable fighting forces in ancient history, and its formidability lay not primarily in individual courage, but in organization, discipline, and logistical sophistication. A Roman legion of roughly 5,000 men was a self-contained military machine capable of building roads, bridges, and fortified camps with the same efficiency it displayed in battle. The roads that the army built, the Via Appia, the great network of highways that eventually connected every corner of the empire, were not luxuries. They were arteries through which Roman culture flowed to the provinces, carrying merchants, philosophers, priests, and plague. For the men who served in the legions, many from provincial populations not from Italy itself, the army was a school of Romanization. Soldiers learned Latin, adopted Roman customs, and were discharged after 25 years of service with Roman citizenship. The army was a machine not merely for fighting, but for making Romans out of people who had been born as something else entirely. If the army was Rome's most formidable tool of conquest, Roman law was its most enduring legacy. Grimal regards the development of Roman jurisprudence as perhaps the most remarkable intellectual achievement of Roman civilization, more original, more profound, and more lastingly influential than Roman art, literature, or philosophy. The story of Roman law begins with the 12 Tables, legal regulations inscribed on bronze tablets and publicly displayed in the Forum around 450 BC. They were not a comprehensive code. They were a partial codification of existing custom produced in response to plebeian demands that law be made visible rather than existing as the secret knowledge of patrician magistrates. But they established a principle central to Roman legal thought: for 1,000 years, that the law must be public, written, and applicable to all citizens equally. What the Romans developed over subsequent centuries was not merely a set of rules, but a sophisticated science of legal reasoning, the ability to derive general principles from specific cases, reason by analogy, and distinguish the letter of the law from its spirit. The great Roman jurists of the classical period, Gaius, Papinian, Oppian, Paulus, were not legislators but interpreters, men whose task was to render the vast accumulated body of precedent into a coherent, rational system. The fruits of this legal science, assembled in Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis in the 6th century AD, shaped the legal systems of virtually every European nation. The concepts of property rights, contracts, legal personality, the distinction between public and private law, the presumption of innocence, all have Roman roots. When modern legal codes speak of dominium, obligatio, or delictum, they are inheriting not merely words, but the conceptual architecture those words express. For all its grandeur, Rome was also a city where people ate, slept, argued, fell in love, went bankrupt, and died from infected teeth. Grimal is attentive to this everyday dimension of Roman life, and his account of daily existence in the city is one of the most vivid sections of his work. Imperial Rome at its height was a city of perhaps 1 million inhabitants, an almost incomprehensible scale by ancient standards. Its residents lived in multi-story apartment buildings, insulae, prone to fire and collapse, chronically short of water, and raucously noisy through the night, since wheeled traffic was banned from the streets during daylight hours. The gap between rich and poor was staggering, in the same city where senators lived in vast palaces surrounded by hundreds of slaves, the majority crowded into single rooms. Eating most of their meals from the cookshops, thermopolia, lining the streets, ancient fast food counters serving hot wine, lentil soup, and flatbread. And yet Roman civic life offered something extraordinary even to its poorest inhabitants: the public baths, thermae. The great imperial bath complexes, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, were not merely hygienic facilities. They were community centers, libraries, exercise halls, and social theaters, available at minimal or no cost. A Roman laborer could enter a building of palatial grandeur, soak in the hot pool, gossip with neighbors, and enjoy mosaics and statuary that would have graced a king's palace. The baths were the great democratic spaces of Roman civic life. For all its grandeur, Rome was also a city where people ate, slept, argued, fell in love, went bankrupt, and died from infected teeth. Grimal is attentive to this everyday dimension of Roman life, and his account of daily existence in the city is one of the most vivid sections of his work. Imperial Rome at its height was a city of perhaps 1 million inhabitants, an almost incomprehensible scale by ancient standards. Its residents lived in multi-story apartment buildings, insulae, prone to fire and collapse, chronically short of water, and raucously noisy through the night, since wheeled traffic was banned from the streets during daylight hours. The gap between rich and poor was staggering, in the same city where senators lived in vast palaces surrounded by hundreds of slaves, the majority crowded into single rooms. Eating most of their meals from the cookshops, thermopolia, lining the streets, ancient fast food counters serving hot wine, lentil soup, and flatbread. And yet, Roman civic life offered something extraordinary, even to its poorest inhabitants: the public baths, thermae. The great imperial bath complexes, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, were not merely hygienic facilities. They were community centers, libraries, exercise halls, and social theaters, available at minimal or no cost. A Roman laborer could enter a building of palatial grandeur, soak in the hot pool, gossip with neighbors, and enjoy mosaics and statuary that would have graced a king's palace. The baths were the great democratic spaces of Roman civic life. The transition from republic to empire engineered by the extraordinary political genius of Augustus, who ruled for 45 years, 27 BC to 14 AD, while maintaining the fiction that he was merely princeps, first citizen, was the most consequential transformation in Roman history. Grimal analyzes it with great care, stressing both what was preserved and what was lost. What was preserved was the form. The Senate continued to meet, elections continued to be held, magistrates were appointed with traditional titles. Augustus was careful never to claim powers that republican predecessors had not theoretically possessed. Instead, he accumulated several traditional powers simultaneously, creating an effective autocracy from the combination of offices no single republican magistrate had ever held together. What was lost was the substance, the genuine capacity of aristocrats to compete for power, the possibility of meaningful political opposition, the culture of libertas, the freedom that Romans associated with the senatorial class's ability to participate actively in directing the state. The price of the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace and prosperity, was the permanent curtailment of political liberty. At the empire's height, under the adoptive emperors of the 2nd century, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, the Roman world encompassed territories from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Latin was the language of administration across the known world. Roman law regulated disputes from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Roman cities with their forums, baths, and aqueducts dotted a landscape that had been wilderness a century before. The question of why Rome fell has exercised historians since Edward Gibbon made it the subject of his great work in the 18th century. Grimal approaches it with characteristic sophistication, resisting the temptation to identify a single cause, and instead tracing the complex interaction of military pressure, economic stress, political instability, and cultural transformation that gradually eroded the imperial system over the course of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. The military crises of the 3rd century, an almost uninterrupted sequence of invasions, civil wars, and usurpations that saw more than 50 men proclaimed emperor in 50 years, exposed the fundamental fragility of a system that depended so heavily on a single figure's authority. The fiscal demands of permanent warfare drove tax increases that strangled agricultural productivity and drove peasants off the land. The silver in Roman coins was progressively debased, producing inflation. Trade networks that had sustained the prosperity of the High Empire contracted. And yet what Grimal emphasizes, following the best modern scholarship, is that what we call the fall of Rome was not a catastrophic collapse, but a prolonged transformation. The Western Roman Empire did not simply cease to exist in 476 AD. It morphed into a collection of Germanic successor kingdoms, whose rulers adopted Roman titles, Roman law, Roman administrative practices, and eventually Roman Christianity. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantium, continued in Constantinople for another 1,000 years, maintaining Roman institutions and Roman identity until its fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. More profoundly still, Rome's greatest gift to the future was not its armies or even its law, but its language. Latin became, through the medium of the Christian Church, the universal learned language of medieval Europe, the language of theology, philosophy, science, and diplomacy for 15 centuries. The Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Latin, transformed by time and geography. And when the Renaissance scholars of the 14th and 15th centuries turned back to the classical sources, they found in Rome not a dead civilization, but a living model, a treasury of political wisdom, literary achievement, and artistic excellence that could be reactivated, re-inhabited, made new.